Continuing on with our discussion about what works, we looked in our last time together at God working through 4 systems. The specialized systems of counseling and support group meetings. These are specialized systems which provide a special focus for the troubled person to gain insight and support. But these are temporary measures. They are not meant to be long-term lifestyle options. But there is the long-term option and support system available to all of us in Christ. That is the cell group and the church. Because we are all in recovery from the fall, and we all need to find our acceptance, our accountability, and our affirmation in body life. That is, life in the church, but especially the real intimacy and life that comes through relationships in the cell group model. Continuing on with what worked for me, I shared how my own cell group and church were very supportive and helpful therapeutically, even though they were not a specialized recovery program. But what else did God do to help me? Well, He brought a lot of healing to me in a lot of ways. Remember earlier in our teaching, we talked about those factors that we must consider when we work with a troubled person, factors that include our biological aspect, you know, the body, and then factors related to our psychological makeup, that is the soul, and then those factors about the supernatural or spiritual realm, which are hard to define, but are nonetheless real. Well, now, we looked at the factors that can cause problems, but now let's briefly look at that model again related to recovery. What worked for me? Where did the Lord mediate healing to me? 3 areas, because after all, I am body, soul, and spirit. Taking a look here at the board, in the area of my body, how did I find healing? Well, first I gained self-control again over my body, submitting it to the lordship of Christ, bringing it under obedience to His standard. That is self-control. But combined with that was being reconditioned. Remember, we talked about renewing our mind and how that also has a very real biological component because of our wonderful neurochemistry. And so as I began to sow new seed, I began to reap a new harvest. So we develop new habits, and that has a biological edge to it, doesn't it, as we've looked and understood. That was one way I found healing. Through an act of will, I put off the old and put on the new and cultivated new habits which became neurochemically entrenched. New habits in the body. In the area of my soul, I had unmet needs, and these were compensated for through new and healthy relationships in the body of Christ. Those blank spaces of my soul began to be filled in through healthy relationships that truly did nourish me. It wasn't just God who did it all, it was God doing it through people that compensated me. Because as wonderful as God is, until you really get revelation of Him, He's not very tangible, is He? And when the wellspring of life is blocked up with all these stones and baggage that blind you to God, you need a tangible model, don't you? That's why the body of Christ. It's sort of like substitute parenting, isn't it? In that Mommy and Daddy were supposed to be my tangible reflection of God. They weren't because of circumstances beyond their control. Consequently, God compensated me with several brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and grandparents and aunts and uncles in the Christian fellowship. While I could not attach on any one of them in particular as my source, nonetheless God would work through them to minister to me His love in a tangible way that did feed my soul and fill up blank spaces and compensate me for my losses. And that enabled me to grow and mature emotionally and therefore relationally. That's how He brought healing to my soul. Combined with that, of course, was learning, was knowledge to feed my intellect. But then God also did a work in the area of the spirit, because we cannot deny the fact that we are living in not only a material world, but there's also the supernatural element around us. And do you know why I want to share this with you? Because so many times people draw this conclusion about me that I am only psychology oriented, or that here, after talking about what recovery is and is not, that somehow I diminish the supernaturalness of the God we serve. And so in fairness to God, not wanting to shortchange Him or misrepresent Him, I want to highlight now a bit of the supernatural and the way that He has done spiritual things in me. Even though it may not be a zap, God has nonetheless done supernatural interventions in my life. And I watch Him do it in my clients all the time, and we should expect it, even if we cannot manufacture it. God does do it His way, His time. Now, when I talk about working in the supernatural, how did God help me to recover? In these practical ways. First, He helped me learn to take advantage of temptation. I cannot make the devil go away, can I? I can rebuke him, but I can never be permanently rid of him in this life. He'll go away and come back. He'll go away and sneak back with a new strategy. And even though I am redeemed, I am not immune to temptation, and I will have temptations at times, either because I deliberately invited them, or Satan made me a target. Now, Satan doesn't play fair, so we should not expect him to always listen to us and obey us whenever we rebuke or command him. We also have to learn to resist him and stand. Now, how do you take advantage of temptation? Here's how. Why would God still let you experience it? Here's why, I think. Now, if I want to do bodybuilding, and I want to increase my strength and develop whatever potential I have to develop my physique and strength, what would I do? I would go to a gymnasium, and in that gymnasium, I would submit to a trainer. He would teach me how to lift weights. Now, he would not let me lift anything too heavy, but he knows that unless I tear muscle tissue, and that's what weightlifting does, it tears your muscle tissue. Yet, you have to lift a weight that will do that. It can't be so heavy that it damages you, but it has to be heavy enough to employ the principle of resistance and overcoming it. So that weight is not easy to lift. However, through an act of my will, I still am able to lift that. It's not too heavy, but heavy enough to employ the principle of resistance, because when it is employed, not only is ultimate strength achieved, but my physique is finally realized in its truest potential. Did you know that this is an absolute model, true for the body, true for the soul, an absolute model of temptation at work? God, the great weightlifting champ, the great trainer, does not let us be tempted beyond what we can bear. And as we employ our willpower and choose to resist evil, it's no different than lifting that weight, is it? And you begin to strengthen yourself as you develop through the principle of resistance. And in that sense, since you can't escape temptation, at least you can see where God turns it into something positive, not an inconvenient negative. And that as you do employ resistance, your will to obey becomes strengthened. Your will toward God is strengthened. And so many of my clients, their will has been weakened, and now they must strengthen it through opportunities to lift that weight. Do I make sense? Now, isn't that a practical way of having to deal with a situation that you're not going to get out of anyway? Now you can see where God works it to your advantage. He who does not let you be tempted beyond what you can lift. Now, God also brings supernatural healing to us. For example, if we have been demonically infected, He will deliver us. We will experience deliverance. I've experienced about 4 major deliverances in my life. And do you know, 3 of them happened spontaneously as points of growth in my Christian development. It was not walking into the deliverance session, renouncing everything on a list, and one big rubber stamp, finished, next, kind of process. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not being critical of that, but I'm saying let us not also think that that solves everything. There can be pockets of infection within the soul that a rubber stamp deliverance session may not resolve because God doesn't want to do it yet. That's why. And so let us not fool ourselves thinking that we suddenly have sewn it all up in one nice little prepackaged process, rubber stamp, doesn't work like that. So while God will deliver us from the oppression, he makes a very clear point, as Isaiah tells us, about the Messiah who would come. He will come to deliver those who have been oppressed, but he will also bind up those whose hearts have been broken. See, that not only deals with oppression in the demonic sense, but it also deals with underlying psychological injuries which enable demonic infection. Remember, we talked about that model, demonic infection, in a wound that pre-existed the infection. So we do see that the Lord will bring deliverance to people, but that will not solve every problem. Another area where supernatural healing will occur in the lives of our clients is in the area of soul ties, where we are metaphysically bonded with somebody in a way that we should not have been because we violated boundaries. Now, in my own history, having been a sexual addict, having been very promiscuous, now that I was a Christian in my 2nd year, I still found myself playing a very rugged tennis match in my mind with impure imagery associated with my past experiences. Naturally, this was very troubling to me, and of course I was laboring under all these false assumptions, as we often do, that I'm a new creation, and therefore the conclusion was I shouldn't have this problem. How many people struggle because they do not understand what recovery is and is not, and what salvation does and does not do related to recovery from life-controlling sexual problems. It isn't the instant zap, and we all understand that. But what did God do to help me in overcoming these impure images? Well, they were always related to people I had had sexual experiences with. And here's what God did on my behalf. He highlighted a point of truth from Numbers chapter 30, verses 3 through 8. In that passage, it's talking about vows and obligations and pledges. And in this scripture passage, to paraphrase it, the Lord is saying this: when the virgin daughter steps out from under her father's authority and she makes a vow or a pledge that is rash and it obligates her, then when she steps back underneath that covering of authority, the husband, or rather the father, has the power to break the consequence of her obligation. Similarly, it goes on to say that when the wife goes out and she makes vows or pledges that obligate her, she's bound by them. But if she steps back under her spiritual covering and authority, that covering or authority has the power, that is her husband, to break whatever the obligation was. The Lord showed me that I had pledged myself in giving myself sexually to people. There was a bond there that was supernatural, spiritual, emotional, metaphysical, even though the physical contact may have been separated for years. It was as though a connection or a doorway had opened, and these memories were not so much Satan's efforts to oppress me as much as they were a symptom of infection or unfinished business that God would not let go away. See, I had to learn to reinterpret it. I'm not being oppressed by the devil. Maybe God's tapping me on the shoulder and saying, I want to undo what you did. So I submitted my memories to him. Here's how. Every time I had an impure memory or fantasy emerge, instead of running away from God, shrinking away in shame, I'm a Christian, I shouldn't feel that. I am a Christian and I feel that. I am a Christian and I remember it and I don't want to. God, I remember it because I pledged myself rashly and wrongly. Forgive me. I choose you now instead of this person, and I want you, Lord, not this situation, and I submit this memory to you, Lord, and ask that you be Lord over it, that you forgive it, that you cleanse it with the blood of Jesus. And do you know what began to happen? After a few months of doing this, every time a memory emerged, after a few months of doing this, every time it bubbled up within me, Not going grave digging, not going searching aggressively, but just as it surfaced. It was like siphoning off the top, skimming off the top of this scum that would float up. And as I did it, pretty soon, scum stopped bubbling up to the surface. Sort of like in the New Testament model where Jesus said to Peter, Peter who had betrayed him 3 times, now Jesus said to him 3 times, "Do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know I do." "Peter, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know I do." "Peter, do you love me?" And in a similar sense, now the Lord was asking to take the place of all those other people I had bonded with, and now I was reinstating him where before I had rejected him as my source. Do you follow me? And as I did this, I found liberty, and in a few months there was no more conflict in that area. To remember sinful past experiences would mean I would have to deliberately conjure them up and dwell on them. I didn't have to fight with them like a tennis match in my brain anymore. That to me was a supernatural, spirit-based healing that had to do with God's authority being reinstated in all of those places where I had committed idolatry by worshiping somebody else as my source. Do you follow me? Now that's strictly on a spirit plane, but it obviously had psychological benefits too, and it made life much more easy. Then also I have benefited from another spiritual form of recovery or healing, and that is in the area of inner healing. Now that term is a highly charged one and often misunderstood one, but nonetheless I don't know a better one. There are many other metaphors we could use, like surgery on the soul, or dealing with damaged emotions, or healing of memories. There is truth related to all of that in understanding inner healing. And yes, there are excesses, but at the core is great legitimacy. Let me give you some examples of the kind of healing experiences I have benefited from. And let me add, I did not know at the time I needed this kind of healing. I am grateful that God, who knows it all, still ministered it to me. Now, my first inner healing experience occurred when I was on my way to a conference where the famous author-speaker Leanne Payne was ministering. Some people don't always like Leanne's particular theology, although in her recent book she explains it very well, and it does not seem troubling to me. But I went with this know-it-all attitude now that I was a Christian for 2 years. And now that I knew everything, I was going to this conference and I just wondered, what is this mystical mumbo-jumbo, inner healing? We're new creations. The past is gone. Don't dwell on that anymore. Let's just go on in Jesus. How like God. He gave me a fabulous inner healing. And only the great economizing God we serve could do 2 things at once, humble me and heal me in one big swoop. Well, he did both. And I learned inner healing is real. And it changed me. Now, here's what happened. I was engaged. It was a few months before my marriage. I had a wonderful relationship with Karen as my fiancée, but I became increasingly controlling, possessive, and suffocating of her as our wedding date approached. She didn't understand why, but she could see that my problem was fear. Her attitude was, I've been on earth 20-some years, and I've been living okay before I ever met you. You don't have to suffocate me to keep me safe. And that's what I was trying to do, keep her safe. And if she would get in a car and drive somewhere and I wasn't with her, I would feel sharp fear that would make me want to say, move over, give me the steering wheel, let me drive you there. This was causing conflict. And yet, in spite of my rational mind, all I knew was, I've got to control her because I'm investing my life in hers, and she could be hurt and I would be left hurt. My motive was not just to protect her, it was very selfish, to protect me. Well, before I left for the conference, we had one last dinner together, and I was eating spaghetti with her, and there in the middle of my plate, I saw this image of my dead mother in her coffin, the last image I had of my mom. Well, I saw that and I felt a stab of pain well up within me. Funny, I had never felt pain at all related to my mother's death. I had carried that snapshot memory image in my mind for years without any association of pain. And now suddenly I felt pain and I said to Karen, I think God is setting me up. Well, indeed. I got there, and she began to pray. She prayed a very simple prayer, and it was like this: Lord, wherever people have been wounded and they are blocked in their relationship to you, show them what they need. That was it. And you know what happened? Suddenly I saw myself a naked, bleeding, wounded 3-year-old child crying out for mommy, wanting mommy so desperately. And then I saw Jesus, but I couldn't get to him. There was a black barrier between us. Then I saw the word forgive come up in the screen of my mind. I wasn't conjuring this up in my imagination, and nobody was leading me on through any kind of guided imagery. This was a videotape playing completely on its own in my mind. God was speaking in symbol to me, and it was very clear. The image of the word forgive appeared, and it became very clear the Lord was speaking. And it was not that I forgive him for allowing pain in my life, but rather I needed to ask God to forgive me for my embittered, mistrusting attitude toward him. You see, these words came back into my mind from childhood. When my mother was killed, well-intentioned Christians trying to comfort me said, "Oh, God just wanted another pretty flower for his garden in heaven, and so he took your mommy." And my attitude was, God is a monster if he robs children of their mommies just so he can have them. It made me not look at God as an advocate. It didn't explain my grief. It made me feel like God could not be trusted with those I loved. And so I said, God, you know, I didn't know that was even there. I see where it's a blockage. Forgive me. And you know what? Instantly in my mind, I saw that barrier dissolve, and I saw Jesus pick up that wounded child and begin to console him. And all Jesus said was, I know it hurts. Well, of course, I cried a little bit and everything, and I thought, wow, I guess that's inner healing, huh? Well, that's pretty neat. Well, it wasn't over. The conference was finished. My roommates had checked out. I was all alone in my room, taking a shower, and there in the middle of my shower was that last snapshot image I had of my mother in her coffin. And then I heard my father's voice from 20 years ago, as it happened on that very day, as he held me and we looked down into the coffin to say goodbye. He said, she's gone now. And all of a sudden, 20 years of repressed pain that I had never cried, and I should have. It erupted from within me. I couldn't have held it back if I had wanted to. God always ambushes me in the most unlikely places. And there I had to climb out of that shower, naked and wet, and sit down on the floor and cry and cry and cry. I cried for 4 days, and every time I tried to stop it, I threw up. Do you know why I cried? Because it was the first time I had ever expressed grief. Because, you know, my father always said, after your mother's death, I was always really worried about you because you never expressed any emotion related to her death. I did what many children do when they suffer great pain. I repressed it. God has engifted the human soul, the psyche, with an unusual ability. It happens subconsciously, not by choice. That when a child suffers a deep trauma and cannot process it, subconsciously the fail-safe system will activate, and the soul will take pain, and it'll cut out all around it a part of your personality, like cutting out a tumor in a brain. It'll cut out the good with the bad, but it'll cut out all around it and take that pain and lock it up into storage until such time you later have the luxury of being able to deal with it as a mature person, where you will not be destroyed by that kind of pain. When a kid can't cope, God has built you to take it and put it into storage. This is a real phenomenon called repression. It's not done by choice. The problem with repression is, while it enables you to survive, it also is like a toxic waste that's buried and it leaks out and affects you. Add to that, a part of your personality has been compromised or sacrificed in locking up that bad wound. And so, as God began to unlock that injury, parts of my personality which had been deadened began to integrate with my consciousness And I began to find interests and skills and memories I never had before. I went through that famous aha syndrome. While it hurt, it healed me. And all those years of bottled up grief that that little boy could never express on that terrible day, they were finally able to be vented, and I was able to close that door on history and grow beyond it. And when I came back from the conference, I no longer needed to suffocate my fiancée. I no longer needed to control her, because now I could entrust her into the hands of God, whom I had judged wrongly due to my injury from childhood. Do you follow me? Now, I didn't know what I needed. And there is how the past was still affecting today. And God did not tell me to go grave digging and figure it out. I was just available. I was just willing. I just submitted, and I benefited. And it changed me in my ability to trust God and relate to others. That is an inner healing. One last example I'd like to share with you, how God did this in my life. I was now a Christian leader, and I was on a platform, a stage, sitting there listening to another speaker, nodding in agreement, being polite and formal before hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And there, again, God is such a good master of ambush, there in front of all those hundreds of people is when God decided I should experience an inner healing. The speaker was talking from Isaiah, where those who worship idols will become like what they worship. We find that statement elsewhere in Scripture, too. He said this, and having experienced deliverance before, I suddenly felt this horrible feeling of manifestation beginning to emerge. What? All these years later, God, and now as a leader, I have a demonic force? Why didn't you take care of it sooner? And here, God, in front of everybody? Oh, thank you. And of course, was my prayer one of humble submission? Oh, Lord, may it be with me as you see fit. Heal me and do whatever you need to do to resolve this issue and bring glory to your name. Did I pray this? No. I said, God, don't let me be humiliated. I'm so glad God knows me and loves me anyway. And He didn't let me be humiliated. Now, everything I've just shared with you is happening in seconds as I felt this manifestation. And also within seconds, I felt the Lord showed me the word idolatry. And I said, I renounce whatever idolatry I had in my life. And within a split-second revelation, as only God can do in your brain at 1,250 words per minute, God showed me my idolatry. When I was a little boy, I developed a very effeminate manner. I developed that effeminacy, as I shared in my own story with you, because I modeled myself after girls in the movies. I filled my identity vacuum where Daddy wasn't there. I filled it up with a female image. Why? Because females were the object of male protection and affection, and I wanted that. And that was now going to be my survival strategy to acquire male affection. That became demonically infected and resulted in a bondage or a stronghold where I had idolized that place of women as the object of male desire. It was a form of idolatry. In other words, if I am like a woman, then I will be loved. That is an idolatrous strategy, looking to men as my source. I did not know this had been deeply embedded in me. God did, and at that moment, He wanted to get rid of that boil by lancing it and washing it clean. It had been with me a long time. And why was it suddenly now surfacing after all these years? Because I was ready to deal with the pain that was underlying, making that possible. So He showed me where my idolatry was that had led to bondage, and I asked Him to forgive me, and I renounced my idolatry, and without any big hysterical manifestation, I just felt release in seconds up there on the stage. Nobody knew. And then after I felt release, I felt awful, awful emotional pain, as if somebody had ripped open a scab or lanced a boil, and it hurt. So I went to a friend of mine, a couple of friends, who minister in the area of inner healing, and I went to them and I said, I need help. Help me now. And they were very gracious, and so the opportunity of time was there, and we were shuttled off to a little room where we could get some prayer. It didn't take long because I was ripe and ready. How like God, when the moment is right, not hours of agonizing, just speaking to the issue in His season. That's why I tell people, don't rubber stamp it, don't push it, don't go grave digging. This is sacred, it's spiritual, and it's up to God, not you. You're just to be willing and available. So, we went in and we began to pray, and just within seconds, I suddenly saw a memory of my childhood. When I was a little boy, after my mother's death, 2 months after her death, my father sent me away to live with relatives. I shared this with you earlier. My father drove several hours to another city I had never been to. He took me to my aunt and uncle's home, people I had never met before. And he took me to the front door. They opened it and took me in and shut the screen door. And my father, having explained to me that he was going away but would come back for me one day, he didn't want to make it a big scene at the door, and he just said, "Goodbye, I'll see you later." And he got in the car and he drove away. All I knew was Mommy was dead, and now my daddy left me with people I don't know. I can't tell you the feeling of abandonment that literally overwhelmed me. But again, I couldn't express it at the point. I had to survive. I had to cope. I had to be a good little boy, bury my fear, and adjust to a situation imposed upon me. And I was terrified. Now, my aunt and uncle were good and loving people. I adjusted to their care. I had no major traumas there, but that wound was left unmended. My need for security and identity was unsatisfied, and that led, of course, that combined with a trauma, the loss of my mother, and then what I perceived as abandonment from my father, led me to my reaction, I cannot trust Daddy, therefore my need for identity cannot be satisfied, and therefore I feel also very insecure, lacking Mommy and Daddy. I must do something to find security, and there I developed a survival strategy, becoming like a girl to acquire male interest, and then it became demonically infected, leading to a bondage. I did not understand how that operated, but God did. So here He showed me the blockage in my life, your idolatry, renounce the strategy. I did. Underneath that, then, was the pain. And you know, that's when God began to minister to me, and I was allowed for the first time in my life to express my deep sense of pain and abandonment when my daddy wasn't there. I was able to cry for the first time in a way I had never had the opportunity to do before. Now I had the luxury to grieve over that loss. And then not only forgive my father, but look beyond him and see that God was there and that God did watch over me because He knew that one day I would belong to Him and He would compensate me for what was lost, and that even if my own earthly father had not been the father I needed, now God could fill in that blank space because that's who my father was supposed to represent to begin with. Now God came in and took His rightful place. Do you see? This is inner healing. It is supernatural, but it affects the soul and your ability to live and love God and others in a healthy way. So while I don't talk about instant zap, and while I don't talk about instant deliverance fixing everything, and while I do minimize some of the rah-rah pie-in-the-sky supernatural stuff, I also want to give God credit where credit is due. He is a supernatural God. Supernatural meaning beyond the natural. Okay? Now, that is what worked for me. And God has brought more healing even since then in my life, and who knows what He has left to do. But you know, I don't really worry much about it, and I don't feel a lot of stigma and shame. I just accept the fact that I was badly injured in life, and if I need multiple treatment, so what? I'll never forget the day I was in a really wonderful time of communion with the Lord, and I said, "Gee, Lord, my life has really been messed up, hasn't it?" And it was like He looked over at me, sort of like He would take my hand and look into my eyes and say, "Yes, it's okay." So, I also want to add, though, those things that messed me up did not really prevent me from living a life submitted to His Lordship. Those unhealed issues that He took years to heal in my life, they did not cause me to go out and live a life of deliberate sin. But sometimes my struggle was more intense. Okay? In one sense, I still have to struggle in an area of fear. I tell people I'm like an emotional diabetic. There are many people in my family who have diabetes. It killed my grandparents on my father's side. It killed my uncle on my father's side. I am at risk. I have to be aware and monitor myself. So far, I have no symptoms, and that makes me thankful. But in another sense, I understand the disorder of diabetes. Diabetes is a metabolic problem. People often relate it to sugar because diabetes is a problem about your body's inability to process carbohydrates. Sugar is a carbohydrate. A normal meal that you could enjoy could kill a diabetic without external injection of insulin to process that food because the body doesn't produce it anymore. Similarly, I have not yet found complete healing in the area of fear. I know all the scriptures about fearing not. I am not ignorant. My problem is not one of intellect. I am willing and available for God to heal me. He has not yet. So I have to live a monitored life. Like all diabetics, I have to stay pretty close around the doctor because when you're a diabetic, you have to live a medically managed and monitored life. You have to be always around the source of insulin. So I have to live around my source, and that's God. I can't ever stray too far because there are those days, like any diabetic knows, when the stresses of life that others might normally handle, I can't. And I begin to get unbalanced, and I begin to become afraid. And that's when I notice my symptoms, and I run to the doctor, and he gives me my dose of peace so that I feel secure and able to cope again. It isn't perfect, but you know what? It's better than living bound by fear. At least fear isn't my master. It does keep me dependent on God, but I guess that's not such a bad thing, is it? It's not a perfect world. Well, moving on, let's look down at our paperwork now about what we can do as caregivers. Pastors and counselors, consider these points. As I shared with you my own experience with my pastor, never underestimate, number one, your symbolic role as a helper. Recognize your symbolic role as a helper. You don't have to have all the answers, you just have to care. Be honest, committed, firm, supportive. Recognize your symbolic role. A little goes a long way when you're a leader. Acceptance, accountability, and affirmation. You don't have to come from a homosexual background. You don't have to be a sexual addict. You don't have to have committed adultery to be able to minister to people in those situations. You don't have to have been a prostitute. But you can show people that you accept them, that you want them to grow by holding them accountable, and that you will affirm them, that they are valuable to you, and that you care about their losses, you want to minister to their hurts, and you also want to affirm their value by investing in their lives. Secondly, remember root issues. Don't just look at the surface symptom. It's easy to say to somebody, you should stop having sex, and absolutely they should. But if they keep messing up, that's not cause to reject them. That is cause to understand that there is an unresolved issue underneath. Or it may be immaturity, there may be elements of oppression, there may be lust in absolutely uncontrolled flesh, and we need to challenge, even rebuke if necessary. But we also need to look beyond what people do and see why people do it. Because that's what God does for us. We need to be patient also because God is patient with us. It's easy to issue absolute ultimatums, but we don't like them issued to us, do we? So I am not excusing sin. Jude verse 4 says, beware of those who teach that God's grace allows sexual immorality. But at the same time, God's grace does give us room to grow up, and I'll work with somebody who messes up as long as they keep getting up and they own their sin and they're willing to be honest and deal with it. That's very different from a person who deliberately lives in unrepentant sin. So let's not get the struggler confused with the rebellious person. Number 3, expect over-attachment. Expect these people who have no boundaries to be threatened by you, and then when they find out you're generous, affectionate, and caring, expect them to over-attach on you. You be a brother's keeper by setting the standard and the boundaries. Don't be frustrated while you expect them to appreciate your limits. They will not appreciate your limits. All they know is, I am desperate, I am hungry, I am empty, I am driven, you care for me, I need you as my security blanket. And they will suffocate you unless you say, no further. You may not call me 15 times a week. I will talk to you twice a week on the telephone, no more than 10 minutes. Now, there are different ways you can say that more comfortably to cushion it, but we need to send a signal and a boundary and a limit to people who do not have them. And we cannot expect them to have them. When they are violated or unloved, or both, their boundaries of appropriate relating are ruined. We have to help them rebuild them. That's part of being a brother's keeper. It's not just unconditional love, 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 love. Love also has limits and boundaries and expectations. That's accountability. Okay? 4, guard your own heart and integrity. We are told in Proverbs, a couple of places, one instance here, we're going to look at the board, is Proverbs chapter 10, verse 9. A person of integrity will walk securely. A person of integrity will walk securely. What is integrity? Pastors, caregivers, ministers, this is what I feel is integrity, though it is not limited to this. Integrity, a person of integrity. Integrity is not what you do. Integrity, I believe, is a condition that will result if you employ at least these 6 things. Okay? Integrity is a condition. It will result if you do these 6 things. A person of integrity depends on God. They recognize their limits and their weaknesses, but they are also responsible for themselves. Dependence on God and responsible for self. A person of integrity is humble. A person of integrity is honest. Honest with themselves. Honest with others. These all overlap, as you can see. It's like looking at a diamond with many facets. All these words bleed into each other or overlap, but they are also distinct. A person of integrity depends on God for grace and strength. That is evidence of humility. A humble person is submitted and honest and takes responsibility for choices and recognizes the need to be not only accountable to God but to others. As has wisely been said, accountability is the price of power. You want to be a teacher, you want to be a leader, you want to be a counselor, you're going to have other people over you who can, so to speak, hire you and fire you. And then you are a person who is obedient. Now notice I did not put the word purity up here. We cannot always expect a pure world, and we cannot always expect purity within us. But whether or not you live in a pure world within or without, if you still operate with these 6 points in mind, you will still have integrity even when you struggle with uncleanness. Do you follow me? But if you remove one of these, you lose the equation. If you remove one of these words, you lose the equation. So this is what I think will help us as leaders navigate through the minefield of risks out there in serving troubled people in the midst of our own weakness. This is the framework, the crutch, the brace of integrity. So even if you have emotions that rage inside, or sexual feelings, or romantic infatuation, if you still model this, you won't get into trouble, I suspect. Okay? 5th, please instill realistic expectations. Instill realistic expectations for those coming for your help. I think I've spent a lot of time here investing in you. Realistic expectations. I've wanted to clearly spell it out and articulate it. And I want you to also do that for those who seek help from you. instill realistic expectations and goals. For example, at the very beginning, when somebody comes to me and they're struggling with an addictive cycle, my goal for you, if you are masturbating 10 times a month, my goal for you is not that you suddenly never masturbate again. That is a bigger goal. That's like if we're on the basement level and we want to get to level 1 goal is self-control, that you're not masturbating like that with that frequency. But we have to climb a staircase there. It may be right and true that we say, don't masturbate again, in that that is evidence of self-control. But at the same time, are any of us perfect in our self-control? So why would we tell somebody an absolute and then demand they do it? Because for someone who continually falls short in that area, it only makes them feel shame and guilt. So what we do is we say, my goal is this week that you only masturbate twice a week. I give you permission. Now, some Christians are not comfortable with that. They think, oh, license to sin, bad, bad, bad. No, that's not what I'm doing. I'm saying I'm giving them a bite-size goal that is achievable, because when they achieve that, then we can take them next month to once a week, then none a week. Now, this is just one model, and I don't have time to go more detailed into all the ramifications of what I've just said. Obviously, we do not wish to encourage people to masturbate at all. That's not what I'm doing. I do not want them to fantasize. That's where a lot of sin comes in, is in the fantasy. And I do want them to gain mastery over what has mastered them as they submit to the lordship of Christ, so where he is established as Lord over what they think and do. But I don't want them to give up with disillusionment and frustration because they can't jump from the basement to level 1. We take a staircase there with achievable goals, okay? We find that with addictive people that works. Some people can do it cold turkey and they never step backward, but we can't apply that absolute blanket concept or expectation on everybody, okay? There's just one little practical outworking of it. Finally, as we conclude this session, if you don't have all the answers and you're not comfortable getting all the answers, my encouragement is that you take advantage of your local community resources. If you don't counsel, send them to somebody who does, but know the source. Don't just blankly send them out to an unresourced source. Know whom you refer to. If you don't minister to somebody dealing with a sexual problem, send them to our agency for a support group meeting if your church doesn't have one. But then we can also liaise with you so that you and we can work together for client benefit. If your client is going to a cell group in your church, let them go there, and you maybe see them once a month, and then we can see them in our support group program weekly. Then when they outgrow our support group meeting, they're still integrated in your church, and they are aware locally in your home church that there are people there who also are aware of the struggle and can provide ongoing support after our phase of helping them is over. So take advantage not only of local resources and referrals, but know the books and materials that are very good and available. Read them yourself, or at least have an idea about where and what you're referring a person to. And even if you don't do the ongoing counseling with that person, even meeting with them once a month, once every other month, or once a quarter still says, I care about you, and what happens to you matters to me. And that perhaps is the most important statement troubled people in our churches. They need to hear from their leaders. Okay? On that note, we'll conclude. When we come back, we'll talk more about recovery and what it means, both individually and corporately, in helping broken people. In this segment, we're going to conclude with our understanding of helping those who struggle with sexual and relational problems. Make no mistake, on an issue as comprehensive as this, Our limited time together will not be able to address every concern and issue. They will be as individual people who seek help. What I've tried to do is provide a framework of understanding that will be something God can build upon, add to, and expand as you continue to serve the Lord and serve those who struggle in this way. So my intent here with our material is not to address every issue and solve every problem. I don't have those kinds of answers anyway. But I am hoping my insights have been beneficial in helping you to understand not only what, but why people do what they do, and what and why relationship-based ministry will help people to recover. In concluding responsibilities related to caregivers, I wanted to highlight a couple of other items. And that is on one of the very important aspects of presenting ministry to a troubled world, we need to do it not only with integrity in our own lives, but we need to correctly represent what we are offering to people. What do I mean by this? Well, when people come to me for help, let's just say they've read about me in the paper, or they've heard through a friend that we offer help, or they've been at a church where I've spoken and suddenly hope is rebirthed within them, that God can help them, that He cares to help them, that there is hope. Then they come forward for help. They will bring with them, indeed, a lot of anxious expectation, perhaps faulty expectations, which is why I've so carefully tried to explain what we recognize as recovery and what we do not uphold or hold forth as recovery. Because we want to impart realistic expectations to our clients without diminishing the supernaturalness of what God is also able to do beyond human limitation. But we want to recognize our human limitations. And one way I do that is that when somebody comes forward to get our help, I have spelled out on a contract with them certain things that I do and don't do, because I want to sell myself honestly before a skeptical world that looks to us for increased credibility these days. And I also want to be honest with the client about what they can rightly expect from me. So I'd like to share with you some of what I have written in what is called our agreement form that the client signs before they ever open their mouth. Okay? I understand and agree to the following. Number one, information shared in prayer counseling sessions and or group sharing sessions will remain confidential within the limits established by the government of Singapore. However, it is our moral and ethical responsibility to inform appropriate individuals and or authorities of any dangerous, harmful, or criminal activity a client intends. If you, as my client, threaten to harm yourself or harm somebody else, or if you, as my client, are having sex with a child or children, I will be required to breach confidentiality to inform potential victims, their families, associates, and or law enforcement officials. We will not be held responsible for ensuing consequences related to this breach of confidentiality. You know, sometimes responsibility of caregiving means we have to take difficult stands. I wish I didn't have to say it, but it is true. There are people who are in jail because I have had to turn them in because they were having sex with children. Now, what happens, for example, based on what I've had to go through as a leader in this field in the United States, I have had people who have sex with children come to me and confess their struggle. That is why we have them sign this statement before they open up their mouth. They understand that in America, I am bound by a legal obligation. Just because I'm a spiritual counselor does not eliminate my responsibility. And sometimes that responsibility is not pleasant. It gave me no pleasure when those pedophiles, people who have sex with children, when those pedophiles still went ahead and confessed to me that they were having sex with children. It gave me no pleasure to have to call up our authorities and report that person. It hurt me to have to hurt them. And you know what? That's probably good that it did. None of us should ever take pleasure in ever having to fulfill disciplinary responsibilities like that. But as part of being a brother's keeper, not only for that pedophile, but for all the children that pedophile never touched, because I turned that pedophile in. I had to be a brother's keeper. And the law in the United States does not give me an option. I become legally liable. I can have my ministry shut down. I can go to jail if I do not report. Now, it's not my fault if I report. That person violated law. Why was the law established like that? Because in the United States, sexual abuse is such an enormous problem that now, even by the time girls reach 18, 1 out of every 3 has been violated. Before the age of 12, 1 out of every 4, and 1 out of every 6 little boys is sexually molested in America. So we had to come up with a law that holds somebody responsible to stop it. History shows, clinically speaking, that pedophiles don't stop themselves. They have to be stopped. And the average pedophile can abuse over 300 people in a lifetime. And we all have looked throughout our time together at what some of the damage of sexual abuse can be. Additionally, many pedophiles have also been victimized themselves as children. They are deserving of treatment, but they have to be stopped often so they get it, so they stop molesting others. And for those who will not stop, then we have to stop them. We cannot change the evil in men's hearts necessarily, but we can restrain the evil that men do. That is why God gave humanity law. He gave human government the right to establish boundaries. I wish I didn't have to say there are people in jail because I had to turn them in. But you know what? One of them was a youth worker in a church having access to lots of young boys. Even family members did not escape his attempt. So the point I'm making here is that there are people out there right now living normal lives, never knowing that they could have been next on the list. They are not victims today because I had to be a brother's keeper and intervene and do something unpleasant related to discipline. But at least I am fair in that I let them know ahead of time that if they confess this information to me, I will take action. Additionally, I have had clients who have attempted suicide. Now, one time a counselor of mine, she had been a lesbian for 25 years. She has been out of that lifestyle now for 22 years. She's got a remarkable story and she has a remarkable ministry. She worked on my staff in the United States, and she had this client who overattached on her and would not take no for an answer. Typically, the client went from praise and flattery, there's nobody like you for me, to that next stage of gift giving. See how much you mean to me? Now, there's nothing wrong with praising and giving, except when we use it as a vehicle to obligate you to me. Well, then, when my counselor knew better than to respond to that, even though she could have opened up a little gift shop with all the goodies that were coming her way, when she refused to submit to that kind of manipulation, the client took it to another level of becoming needy, professionally needy. She had no interest in growing up and taking responsibility or getting better. All she wanted was to be needy and the object of sympathy, pity, and affection and interest. And when my counselor would not give in to that form of manipulation, then she became desperate and threatened. Well, if I can't have you, I don't want to live. And so she attempted suicide. She called up the office one day. I'm just calling to let you know you can cancel future appointments. I'm checking out. Click. So, of course, we called 911 emergency rescue, even though William Shatner didn't arrive, and I was disappointed. They did send the ambulance, and indeed she had overdosed, and they did pump her stomach, but her little bubble of fantasy was popped. Our client thought that she would suddenly express her great need like this, and that our counselor would suddenly see, oh, I never knew how much I meant to you. I'm so sorry. Let me throw my life into the canyon of your abyss. Consume me. That was actually her fantasy. That was what she thought she would get if she pulled this stunt. And instead, she got locked up in something somewhat like Woodbridge, a psychiatric institution where she deserved to be. And there she got treatment, and after a year and a half, she was released. Much better. The detachment there was healthy. The attachment was broken. Now, the reason we told on her, and it made her mad, but the reason we called the police and explained the situation to them and called the emergency rescue people is because we had to violate confidentiality. We had to breach that to explain to them, to help them make sense of her case. And she signed that form ahead of time, knowing that if she attempted something like that, that gave me the freedom then to not be responsible for what I had to tell, for people to help her. Okay? So I make people aware of that from the beginning. Then, moving on down to another point here, I tell people who come to me for help and they sign this statement, this is a lay ministry, not a clinical professional practice. I am not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and I do not pretend to be. Moving on, we do not claim to have all of the answers or cures to sexual, relational, emotional, and identity disorders. Referrals to professional and paraprofessional resources will be made when perceived as necessary. I think that that's just an upright thing to say to somebody so that they do not come thinking, I've got all that they need, that I'll fix it all for them. I can't. I may be an ingredient of support, and that is about it. So there are other guidelines, but I think those are perhaps the most important related to ethics and responsibility in expectations conveyed to client. I will also add, as I mentioned before, we have a form that we have our clients also sign related to the group rules. I failed to mention to you, so I need to say it now, that when a client comes to us and they find that they have been attracted to somebody in the group, or somebody is attracted to them, I've given you, what we tell them to do in terms of guidelines. We also have a sober warning at the bottom of that sheet they sign that if they have sex within the group setting, in other words, if they have a sexual failure with another group participant, they are out of the group until I change my mind about it. They have to re-earn my trust because that immature act within the group will not be tolerated because our group is not for that purpose, and that's the last thing I want group participants to have to worry about. Now, it's one thing if you're in my group and you have a moral failure out of the group. Yes, you are still allowed to participate. But if you are attempting to have sex with somebody in it, well, this is not a shopping center or a candy store. Go somewhere else. But I didn't really mean to do that. It wasn't my intent. We just fell. Okay, I can accept a failure, but still a failure of this magnitude within the group, when I've given you guidelines not to, deserves disciplinary action. I'm taking you out of the group until such time that the way you live proves to me you're ready to integrate back into it. That could be a month, a week, 2 years. Now, individual counseling will be available or a referral will be available, but not group participation, because I gave you guidelines, you couldn't even manage that. That tells me you're not mature enough for a group setting. That's where we have to go, and deservedly so. But again, 99.9% of the time, that's not a problem over the years. Okay? Because the people do come reasonably motivated from the beginning. Okay? Now, in revealing realistic expectations to our clients, here's just a couple more models that we'll conclude our insight time with. Moving over here, here's the model I want to paint for our clients. Again, it puts it in the macro picture, doesn't it? Not just a sexual problem, but human problems, and a journey they are now included in, along with all the other people who make up the Christian community. It's important that they see they are part of the macro picture, and that their sexual and relational problems are part of human problems, not just special sexual problem, okay? So, while there is deserving attention focused on specific need, nonetheless, we need a macro picture. We begin life in Egypt, don't we? Sold out to slavery, born there, born in slavery, not necessarily our fault, but that's the way it is. Egypt for our clients, and now we're talking kind of on relationship terms, Egypt for our clients is a land of carnal, fallen relationships. Egypt is a land of enslavement to survival strategies. Egypt is a land of dissatisfaction. Your true potential in life is not realized when you're a slave. And they live in slavery to these survival strategies in an attempt to meet their deepest needs. God's goal, however, is the promised land. I'm not talking about heaven, but rather the promised land that we can reasonably expect here on earth, because after all, the promised land was a physical place on the planet, right? So we're not talking about heaven when we say promised land. Here on earth, what can our clients expect as they improve, working through their relationship hang-ups and growing and maturing? What can they expect? The promised land here on earth is a land of right relationships. Notice I did not say perfect relationships. There may be conflict, there may be disagreement, we may hurt or offend or frustrate or fail each other, but those damages can be repaired, can't they? It is a land where we can maintain healthy relating as opposed to carnal, fallen, faulty relationships. The promised land here on earth is a land of right and healthy relating. And where we do get hurt or where we do mess up, we can own that, repent of it, and repair it. Then the promised land is a land of realizing your potential, at least to a degree. You don't have that option when you are enslaved to survival strategies. Everything else is very secondary, regardless of whatever intellectual or material success you may achieve. You may not actually be realizing God's design for you on earth. It is an opportunity then for us to experience satisfaction, isn't it? Satisfaction. Not perfection. I do not live a perfect life. I still have weaknesses. I still have things to work on in my life. I can still be frustrated. There are pressures and responsibilities and risks. All of that big juggle in life isn't easy at times. It's not a perfect life I have today. But you know what? I am reasonably content and satisfied, living a life I never dreamed possible. And I enjoy realizing my potential in terms of advancing God's kingdom, not my own. I feel like I have a life worth living. And it's wonderful icing on my cake. Now that I live on borrowed time, having been redeemed, I now feel content and satisfied in the midst of imperfection. I think that's realistic that people can expect satisfaction, even if not perfection. There's still frustrations, still imperfections and weaknesses. But I'm reasonably content. And that's a great wealth to have, quite frankly. How many people on earth are not content? And how many of us, even in affluent nations, are trained never to be content, ever having to strive for more? So I think that's what we can realistically expect, isn't it, from this recovery journey? Right relationships, satisfaction, and in place of slavery here from Egypt, it's a land of freedom. But now when I talk about freedom, I do not mean immunity to temptation or the elimination of risk. We've already made that clear. What do I mean by freedom? The ability to choose who will be your master. Before the Bible told me, before Jesus bought me that freedom, I had no option. I was a slave, sold into slavery to sin, Whatever mastered me was my master. I was a slave to sin. But now he has purchased freedom for me to be a slave to righteousness. Because I am still of a fallen nature, I will always have to have a master. No independence that way. But who will be my master? I choose it to be Jesus now, not sin, not weakness. And that is a freedom I never enjoyed before. So that's the kind of freedom I think that we can offer people now. We now have a new master whose yoke is easy, whose burden is light. Whereas in Egypt, it wasn't easy, was it? It was quite a pressure. Now, none of us go from Egypt into a direct translation into the Promised Land. We go through the wilderness. And what is the wilderness and why is it important? You will be in that wilderness whether you're in the middle of a crowd or not. That's not the issue. The wilderness, of course, is within that empty place of the soul where we learn to let go of Egyptian ways of surviving. Yet we're not plugged into healthy relating yet. We must learn to let go here. We're not plugged in here. Instead, we must cling to God now as the source in whom we trust. Because you know why this is very important? When we do learn to let go of Egypt and when we do transfer trust onto God, then when he moves us into a land of human-to-human relationship opportunities, we are not clinging to people with the old Egyptian mentality. It's no longer the survival strategy that it used to be. It's as if God finally brought us into the wilderness and slapped us enough that we finally let go of that old way, and now we no longer need humans in the desperate way we did, and we've learned to draw on God as our source. You see, in the wilderness, that's where we learn to trust. And we are not ever going to volunteer to do that. We have to be volunteered. And it is in that wilderness where in the midst of a crowd, God knows how to isolate and frustrate you to get your attention. In America, we have a saying, your arms are too short to box with God. And that's pretty much the truth. You either submit, you are either going to fall on the rock and be broken, or the rock will fall on you and smash you. You choose. Better to volunteer than be volunteered. Better to stay in the furnace and sweat it out than to try to climb out, because you'll just be thrown right back in eventually. And if you won't submit, then you'll rebel and run away, and you'll be disconnected. And then you will devolve back into bondage, I fear. So this is a crucial point. It's not an option. People must learn to transfer their deepest trust needs onto a God who is invisible and intangible in spite of all of that. And also in the wilderness, we learn to trust God because we see him prove himself, and also we get purified in the wilderness because all of our mistrust comes to the surface. And in the wilderness, our survival strategies, they will manifest as well. That's where the Hebrew children looked back to Egypt and said, at least in Egypt we had food to eat. How like my clients, I hear them say, here I've been trying to obey God for the last 8 months, and now my temptations and struggles are worse than ever. Well, of course they are. You've given up the old survival strategy. You're not feeding your flesh like you used to. Now it's hungry, and it wants you to go back to the old way of getting satisfaction and security, and you're telling it no, and it doesn't like it. It's making demand on you. You're idealizing the past, and you've got to crucify that strategy because it has no part in the promised land of right relating. Why else do you think God gave us that model of the Hebrew children journey? We have to be purified in our relating to God by trusting him. And when he is our source, we stop clinging and demanding in idolatrous over-expectations on other people. We stop trusting the arm of flesh as our survival strategy, and we look to God, who gives us what? The daily manna. Manna, that provision, that grace that sustains us. And as that part of our cup is filled up, then we have less demand for others in the limited amount they can offer. Do I make sense? That's why we will make this journey. I don't care what your background, but particularly people who have a problem risking and trusting God. This before this. To put that in perspective, here's one final model I like to share with people who are in recovery. Again, my teaching seminars may give insight, but they don't solve everything. So what are our clients left with 10 years after they've come out of our program? What are our clients going to have to do 2 years after they walk away from our support group meeting and all of their problems are not cured? Well, this is a model that they need to live within, the commitment triangle. Commitment. Mature people are willing to take the risks and responsibilities of commitment. And the only way you reap reward is when you take the risk and responsibility of commitment. Commitment to Christ, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, in blessing and in loss, I will trust Him as my source. Will we say like Job, though he slay me, yet I will not curse him, but I will trust him? God knows, and only God knows, what lies up ahead for any of us. And we can know that there will be blessing, and there will probably be suffering and loss for us all at some point, somehow, some way, someday. We are promised this in Scripture. But God is not negligent, and God is not unconcerned, and He will be with us in it. And if we choose to trust Him, we walk down a different avenue than bitterness and blame can afford us. So, will I trust Him for better or worse? You know, as a married man of 11 years at the time of this taping, I have already learned that every commitment that matters will be tested, because we live in a fallen world with a predator. Every commitment in life that you make that really matters, it will be tested. Why should you be surprised? Proverbs 27 verse 7 says, Proverbs 27 and Proverbs 22 tell us, the wise man sees that the day of trouble will approach. Eventually it'll be there, and before it arrives, he has made a preparation for it in his heart. We should not be so shocked at suffering. We don't have to like it, we don't have to want it, we don't have to appreciate it, but we cannot escape it. And we cannot necessarily escape being tempted or having struggles or facing weaknesses. We're going to have to remain committed in spite of those things, because like I am married and others are no longer available to me unless I break my vows, similarly, I have forsaken all other sources and gods as my source of security, and I'm committed to Christ. That commitment will be tested. That's why I wish to be faithful. Isn't it the faithful who arrive where they're supposed to? Not those who have it struggle-free, but those who are faithful. Then we have to be committed to the change process, don't we? Because none of us are finished. I tell my clients, okay, maybe we've spent a focused season looking at some of your sexual and relational problems. You've grown and you've gained insight, and now you can manage your life. But now what about it from this point on? You're going to have to be committed to change, because God isn't finished with anybody yet. You've got to be committed to God's unfolding work in your life. This is reasonable. And then we have to be committed to the cause of Christ, don't we? Beyond our own introspective but legitimate needs, there's the bigger need of the world around us. That's why I'm so thankful I have a chance to minister in a lot of third world settings. And not long ago I was in Brazil, and there I saw again that true dynamic that says, if you think you've got problems, and while I don't ever minimize somebody's pain, loss, or problem, sometimes we need a glimpse of the world around us to recognize that some of our discomforts and problems are pretty minor compared to some of the struggles others have. And maybe minor isn't the appropriate word. Many of our struggles are at least manageable and resolvable compared to what others will experience. I remember working in the slums in Brazil on the last couple of trips I made there, seeing amid the prostitutes who were HIV infected with oozing sores in their bodies, coughing up tuberculosis. They're living in their squalor, in their prostitution slums, the pimps and the prostitutes there to listen to me. I was invited at a party where a Christian worker was wanting to celebrate her birthday among the prostitutes and give them a big birthday too, to show them that their lives mattered to God. And there in this great city of São Paulo, where we were working with what are called the povo marginal, meaning the people who are marginalized, on the outcasts of society, working in a district of the city called Boca do Lixo, which means the mouth of trash. There where the people are relegated to live their lives. There in the midst of all of that despair and hopelessness and bondage, there was a little bit of light, some concerned Christians in there showing these prostitutes in the midst of their terrible bondage and infection, God loves you, and we want to show you by the way we treat you. And there they were giving them a birthday party, and you know what was more heartbreaking than the condition of these outcast, abandoned prostitutes? It was the little children. In Brazil, there are 3 million orphan children between the cities of São Paulo and Rio alone. You've heard about some of those kids being shot in the streets by vigilante groups because they are very predatory, because they are not much more than animals. They've been so dehumanized. And there in this prostitution slum were these little children living like squatters, tolerated by the prostitutes but not cared for. The only kind of affection that they know is somebody's sexual embrace. That's why many of them are not only born to drug-addicted prostitute mothers, they are HIV, because even though many of them are under the age of 12, they are very, very knowledgeable prostitutes. And 80% of these children, they are HIV infected. They will never know what it's like to be held. They will never know what it's like to be loved. They will never know what it's like to have purity or a bedroom of their own. They'll never know what it's like to live in an air-conditioned home. They'll never know what it's like to have a birthday party for themselves. Sort of like Lazarus, that beggar before the rich man's house. They will die with dogs licking their wounds because in this life they won't get it all. It's a fallen world. And so while it is true the people I work with, they have their overwhelming needs, we mustn't forget the needs around us. I won't forget when I was walking through the Hospital de las Clínicas in São Paulo, one of the largest hospitals south of the equator in the world. There, this precious chaplain took me into the infectious disease ward. And there I walked down this long corridor and into the rooms, room after room after room after room, filled with beds after beds after beds after beds, people dying with AIDS. Not one visitor, not one bouquet of flowers, not one card, not one letter, not one visit. These people were abandoned because they got infected, abandoned by their culture, warehoused to die. Who will ever show them that their lives matter to God in spite of what has happened? And so it is true, my clients are often very broken and wounded and needy people, but you know what? That's the condition of the entire human race. And so while introspection is good and we need it to become better disciples, our ministry is about helping make disciples. Beyond making disciples, I tell my clients, hey, don't be so introspective, you know. To whom much is given, much is required. On the top deck of the Titanic of society where we live in affluence, on that dry but tilted top deck, we shouldn't be busy running around trying to find better cabin accommodations when people on the lower decks are just trying to keep from drowning. We've got to get them into life jackets so that even if they die, at least they die prepared to encounter their Creator. So while it is true, my clients have their needs, and I want to address them, I give myself to a specialized form of discipleship making. We must never forget the greater picture of the cause. Jesus isn't interested in fixing you so you can run back to a comfortable life in suburbia as if it never happened. Now to whom much is given, much is required. And so, I share these things to help our clients persevere in the midst of their own human struggle. It gives them a purpose, even in the midst of imperfection and pain. Pain with purpose can get a lot of good things done, you know. And so we want to encourage our clients to persevere. Who gets the crown of life? Them that persevere. Abraham Lincoln, one of the great presidents of the United States, one of the best known and best loved around the world because of his stand against slavery. Abraham Lincoln had 22 political failures before he ever achieved his destiny as president at a crucial time in U.S. history. 22 political failures. I don't know about your ego. That would be rather hard for me to take. He persevered, and he got the crown, didn't he? Likewise, Christ persevered in the midst of his struggles. He got the crown. I want to persevere, and I want you to persevere. Another U.S. president, Calvin Coolidge, he is not as famous, but he had a wonderful quote related to perseverance. He said, "Press on. Nothing will take the place of perseverance. Talent will not. Unrewarded talent is almost a proverb." He said that genius will not take the place of perseverance. Also, unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. He said education will not take the place of perseverance. The world is filled with educated derelicts. He said perseverance is omnipotent, and it's true. So press on. Ultimately, that's what I hope what I've offered you will do. It will encourage you to persevere toward that crown. Amen? Amen. Amen. I thank you for the opportunity to share these insights with you. If we can serve you further, be in touch with me, based here in Singapore, or you can be in touch with the Exodus International Network throughout the world. We have bases in North America, Europe, the South Pacific. We're formulating them now in Asia as well as in South America. So Exodus can also serve you in providing resources and referrals as you seek to serve Christ, advance his kingdom, and minister to those who come to you in need. Thank you.